Hello and welcome to Red Read. Today, on this sweltering hot 41 degrees Celsius day in Sydney, Australia, I want to talk about Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This is the third Woolf book that I have read. The first was A Room of One's Own, the second being To the Lighthouse, and now Mrs. Dalloway. And I'm really happy to say that just every time I read a Virginia Woolf book, I just keep getting more and more pleasantly surprised, and that she's just such a masterful writer. One of the things that's kind of obvious to tell, or you can't help making the comparison if you've read it as well, is the similarities between Mrs. Dalloway and Ulysses, because of both of them sort of being that the premise just being that it is the inner monologue and the events and the life of a character over a single day. And I want to talk about one of the things that I really liked in Mrs. Dalloway, that even though I'll preface this by saying Ulysses is probably, a top 3 favorite book and is maybe a desert island book, I'll talk about some things that I actually got out of Mrs. Dalloway that I didn't get out of Ulysses. But so the general idea, I was glad that I started with To the Lighthouse, by the way, because just that was the book of hers that I'd heard the most about. I think it's the most people talk about it as being maybe her best book, and I absolutely love the premise of just, here's one line of dialogue and then we're going to zoom in and spend 4 or 5 pages talking about what goes into what went into building up this person to make them say this one line of dialogue, and then you'll hear a response from another person, just another 1 or 2 lines, and then you get another slew of pages that is just all of their story and how they're related to person A, and it's just so brilliant. But I did feel like when I was reading To the Lighthouse, there were some times when you kind of get so hazy and foggy that it can be a little bit hard to you almost have to just go, oh crap, and then just go back and reread that paragraph again. While I think Woolf also used similarly hazy, foggy descriptions in Mrs. Dalloway, I found that I really, really liked how good she was at sort of easing you into that absurd area where she's very much in the stream of consciousness and things are not necessarily making so much sense. And I have a couple of extracts to read to talk about that, but just overall general plot structure, spoilers from here, I guess. So the general plot is that Clarissa Dalloway, she wants to put on one of her sort of regular tea parties, and she's thinking about inviting some people. All of a sudden, out of the blue, an old friend, Peter Walsh, shows up and sort of triggers some memories in her. She starts to remember that they were actually sort of in love, or that he was in love with her, but she was a bit on the fence about him when they were younger. And Clarissa ended up doing what she described as sort of the safe choice of marrying Mr. Dalloway, a politician. And so eventually we get introduced to some other childhood friends. The dinner party goes on, and it's we just get this sort of these micro and macro resolutions. It's probably fair to say there's micro resolutions because everything just in day-to-day life goes on pretty much the same as normal. But I think that this book does a really great job, just like Ulysses, of showing how in-depth a single moment can be, but also B, how big things, big events that have been sort of building up over the course of years and decades of a person's life can really be resolved just in one day. And you can sort of move on and have a really profound transition phase that just happens in a normal day. And I like that Mrs. Dalloway, in Mrs. Dalloway, Woolf pretty much just chose a really perfect day to do that and to have a lot of those sort of micro realizations and resolutions. Another thing that I really liked is that in Ulysses, you get a contrast of sort of 2 different minds over the course of the day. You've got Stephen Dedalus and you've got Leopold Bloom, but in Mrs. Dalloway, Woolf uses Clarissa Dalloway and a man named Septimus, and he is a sort of shell-shocked World War One soldier, and he, it's a very tragic story that hit with him and his wife, Lucrezia, and that goes on and sort of deteriorates in its own way, leading to his eventual suicide. And of course, as is the case whenever you're thinking about a book and you're thinking about what are, if any two things are happening at the same time, how are they related? And so of course you're meant to sort of juxtapose and think about the similarities between the two, or the links, and it's pretty much almost not spoiled, but explicitly mentioned by Woolf later on, where when Mrs. Dalloway hears about Septimus's suicide, she feels it so deeply that it feels like it's her own tragedy, and I might have to dig into that, because I don't know how much I necessarily liked that. I don't know. I'll have to think more about it, but what I liked about it, and this is something I actually didn't get in Ulysses, is that time, the same unit of time can feel very different for a lot of people. So in a sense, when Mrs. Dalloway goes down her stream of consciousness train of thought, and she remembers her childhood with Peter Walsh and with her best friend, who was sort of like a intellectual, a staunch feminist, and so on and so forth, in the best way, by the way. And when she has those sort of realizations, she almost sort of loses track of time. And there's this extract I want to read later where she's just thinking about something, and then all of a sudden the doorbell rings, and she's like, oh my gosh, and she just gets up and opens the doorbell. But with Septimus, when he is thinking about everything, he's coming to these profound truths of nature that, people shouldn't harm each other, and that nature is all good, which of course is one of those sort of just tragic, simple truths that you only come back to after you've been in a really traumatic circumstance. The thing that I liked about Septimus is that when he gets lost in his trains of thought, it feels like that's the entire universe for him, and that life just drags on, and he can painfully feel every single moment of these of his stream of consciousness. It's more like a sludge of consciousness, I suppose. And all of this is sort of framed around in the real world, where the Big Ben is chiming to just let people know what time it is, because of course Mr. Dalloway is going off to have he's doing something in the day before the dinner party starts. And I just thought that was a really clever thing, and that I really probably my favorite takeaway from Mrs. Dalloway was just this idea of the same unit of time feeling different for different people, and how well she portrayed that with Clarissa and Septimus. So the only other thing I have left to do is just to read a couple of extracts. So just to give you an idea of how, one, how good of a technician Woolf is, and two, how great of a poet she can be. So let's get into it. This is from early on. This is just page 8. And we're talking, she is Mrs. Dalloway. She would not say of any one in the world now that they were this or were that. She felt very young, at the same time unspeakably aged. She sliced like a knife through everything, at the same time was outside looking on. She had a perpetual sense, as she watched the taxicabs, of being out, far out to sea and alone. She always had that feeling that it was very, very dangerous to live even one day. Not that she thought herself clever, or much out of the ordinary. How she had got through life on the few twigs of knowledge Fraulein Daniels gave them, she could not think. She knew nothing, no language, no history. She scarcely read a book now, except memoirs in bed, and yet to her it was absolutely absorbing. All this, the cabs passing, and she would not say of Peter, she would not say of herself, I am this, I am that. Just a brilliant introduction. And another thing is that I'm trying to simultaneously say, I want to say two things. Like, one is, I think that Mrs. Dalloway is a really great intellectual work, and I don't want to diminish anything about it. But I also think that it is just a much more accessible and easier to read, like, stream of consciousness than Ulysses. And so it's probably just got to do with the way that Woolf saw the world versus the way Joyce saw the world. And I know that this is just absurd, and maybe Borges was being cheeky or tongue-in-cheek or even facetious when he said this, but I still think about the fact that Borges, before he wrote Funes, his memory, compared Joyce to Funes, and just how much detail Joyce was seeing in a day. I think that Woolf does a really good job of kind of limiting how much a person's actually seeing, because actually seeing and experiencing, because she almost sort of limits the stream of consciousness information to the personality and, for fear of being derogatory, intelligence of the person who she is whose stream of consciousness she's describing. Like, she's actually describing things that they would literally see and they would literally process, and so there is a wide spectrum of what's of, you know, how much a person can see and what they see. In Ulysses, it's kind of assumed that Daedalus and Leopold see everything, like they're just absorbing every single thing. And then jumping actually just 2 pages later, almost capping off that section, still Mrs. Dalloway. But often now this body she wore, she stopped to look at a Danish picture, this body with all its capacities seemed nothing at all. She had the oddest sense of being herself invisible, unseen, unknown, there being no more marrying, there and no more having of children now, but only this astonishing and rather solemn progress with the rest of them, up Bond Street, this being Mrs. Dalloway, not even Clarissa anymore, this being Mrs. Richard Dalloway. And again, another insight, of course, that Woolf is going to provide that we might not get in other works is just like from the perspective of a female writer in that sense, or in that time. Again, we're still talking about Mrs. Dalloway. It's almost like she's the namesake of the book, talking about time. But she feared time itself, and read on Lady Bruton's face, as if it had been a dial cut in impassive stone, the dwindling of life, how year by year her share was sliced, how little the margin that remained was capable any longer of stretching, of absorbing, as in the youthful years, the colours, salts, tones of existence, so that she filled the room she entered, and felt often, as she stood hesitating one moment on the threshold of a drawing-room, an exquisite suspense, such as might stay a diver before plunging, like while the sea darkens and brightens beneath him, and the waves which threaten to break, but only gently split their surface, roll and conceal and encrust as they just turn over the weeds with a pearl. Firstly, how lovely and poetic is that? Secondly, how nice is that syntax? I instantly love anyone who has, who strings 3 or 4 semicolons in a row, but where Woolf puts the commas, I love it so much. This is a nice simile that just stood out to me. There, she's describing just a bunch of realizations, and she writes, "All this she saw as one sees a landscape in a flash of lightning," and that's a really that's an image that I like as well, and it gave me the same feeling of a Sylvia Plath poem that I can't remember the name of off the top of my head, but she describes the sun as like a beaming cyclops' eye, and I just thought that's so brilliant. And here's here's the extract. This is the last extract I want to read. All of these, by the way, are still very early on. This is an extract on page 40, and the book goes on to about 200. So there's not too much that I've spoiled, I suppose. But this talks about how Mrs. Dalloway goes down a stream of consciousnesses, sees, and loses track of time. And also kind of gets into being pretty absurd. Like, if just reading this in isolation, thinking about how simple the rest of the book can be, or like the start and easing in can be, just think about how kind of absurd this is. Quiet descended on her, calm, content, as the needle, drawing the silk smoothly to its gentle paws, collected the green folds together and attached them very lightly to the belt. So on a summer's day waves collect, overbalance and fall, collect and fall, and the whole world seems to be saying, that is all, more and more ponderously, until even the heart in the body which lies in the sun on the beach says too, that is all. Fear no more, says the heart, fear no more, says the heart, committing its burden to some sea, which sighs collectively for all sorrows, and renews, begins, collects, lets fall, and the body alone listens to the passing bee, the wave breaking, the dog barking, far away, barking and barking. Heavens, the front doorbell! Exclaimed Clarissa, staying her needle. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say about Mrs. Dalloway. I hope I was able to convince you to give this a read. It's a really kind of beautiful and great for you book. It's almost like it's tastes good and it's got a lot of carbs, so you're going to feel really full at the end. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Recommend any other Virginia Woolf books for me because I'm be more than happy to check them out. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video.